Hello, so this is the nature-nurture debate. And what this debate is about is whether behaviour stems from our genetic makeup or whether it's learnt through experience. So taking the nature end of the debate, this is really based around this idea of nativism. So the man you can see in the top left there is René Descartes. And what he suggests is that the soul, when we're born, is already equipped with an understanding of key concepts, things like time. He was a nativist, and his theory formed the basis of the nativist view. We're born with dispositions and pre-programmed behaviours. So studies based on looking at genetics, evolution at twin studies, again that focusing on genetics, shows support for this point of view. Whereas if we look right down the other end, at the nurture end of this debate, it's this idea of empiricism. So the man you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there is John Locke. And this is the opposing view to the nativist view, this empiricism. And it suggests that we aren't born with any innate mechanisms. We are a tabula rasa, as John Locke put it, which means a blank slate, and experiences are what write onto this slate and lead us to behave the way we do. So things like the behavioural approach supports this. So looking at examples of nature and nurture now, when we look at the examples of nature, this is explaining behaviour as a result of some form of heredity, which is looking at the processes in which traits are passed down genetically from one generation to the next. So examples of this are genetic explanations. So when we look at family or twin studies or adoption studies, the closer the two individuals are genetically, the more likely they are to both show the same behaviours. And there's lots of research that you'll look at later on in the course that relates to that as well, which would suggest behaviour is as a result of our genetics. But we also look at evolutionary explanations, which is also an example of the influence of nature on behaviour. And this is the idea that behaviour or a characteristic that someone has that promotes survival or reproduction will be naturally selected for. And this is because they're adaptive, so the genes for that behaviour will therefore be passed on to subsequent generations. Down the other end of the debate, we have examples of the influence of nurture, the influence of experience, and that's particularly important in the example of behaviourism. So behaviourists assume that all behaviour can be explained in terms of experience alone. So, for example, B.F. Skinner used the concept of operant conditioning to explain learning. So if someone carries out behaviour is rewarded for it, they're more likely to carry out that behaviour in future, and they're more likely therefore to show that behaviour. And also another example of that is social learning theory. So not only do we have to be, or not only can we be rewarded to lead to the behaviour being seen, but if we watch somebody else, we learn through somebody else's experience, vicarious learning, and we watch someone else be reinforced, be rewarded maybe, then we may well carry out that behaviour as well. So learning through our own or somebody else's experience will shape our behaviour characteristics. Now, the key thing to look at here is it is very, very unlikely and really hard to separate nature from nurture, and it's not very unlikely that any behaviour can be explained purely by one or the other. So the debate is no longer about whether it is nature or nurture that leads to our behaviour, but it's the relative importance of the two, the relative importance of heredity and the environment in determining behaviour. And as we're interested in the relative importance, we're looking more now at an interactionist approach, because it doesn't make sense to separate the two stances because they're so closely linked to one another. we need to study how they interact and influence each other. So we can look at the relative influence through twin studies. So the idea is that if you have an identical twin or a monozygotic twin, they share 100% of their DNA. So if the behavior is entirely due to someone's genetics, then we'd expect them to behave exactly the same, but they don't. Therefore, the environment must also have an impact. Adoption studies, again, also useful as they show the relative influence of nature and nurture, because what we would expect to see, or what we'd be looking at seeing, is does an adopted child behave more like their biological parents, suggesting it's more to do with genes, or behave more like their adopted parents, suggesting it's more to do with the nurture side of it? Or is it kind of equal? So this shows why we just cannot separate nature and nurture. It must be looked at together. So just to give you some key terms there, feel free to pause the video and write a few notes down for these in your own time. I won't read them to you now. Okay, so when we're thinking about evaluation for the nature-nurture debate, what we're really looking at is reasons why nature and nurture cannot be separated. Okay, why we can't take completely opposing views here. So there's a few things that we can look at. First of all, we'd looking at the interactionist approach and saying why that's needed. And then there's 3 things here that we're going to go into a bit more detail in just a moment. So we've got the diathesis stress, nature affecting nurture, and also nurture affecting nature, to show just how you cannot separate them because they influence one another. So, an example of an interactionist approach here, in some research here for you, which will become more relevant as you go through the study as well. So the diathesis stress model, this is where there is a gene for a behavioural disorder, but it's got to be switched. It's got to be triggered by an action or a stressful event in the environment. So you have a genetic predisposition, but in order for you to behave in that way, something must happen in the environment to trigger it. Therefore, this is both nature and nurture there. Okay, so there's a few examples here of nature affecting nurture. And so we start off with the evocative interaction of genes and environment. And this is where heritable traits influence the reaction of others. And so the environment provided by those others also changes. So, for example, if a shy child, particularly if that's genetically influenced, the shyness may be less fun to other children because they're not as outgoing, making other children less likely to want to spend time with them. And so that's an example of how the individual's nature, their genes, affects their environment, which will then, have another effect on them as well and continue the shyness, perhaps. Then we have a passive interaction, and this is where genetic influences on parental behaviour, so the behaviour that a parent shows based on their genes, creates a particular environment in which their children are raised. So that's sort of the influence of the parent's genes on the child there. And then finally, an active interaction between genes and environment. And this is where a child's heritable traits influence their own choice of environment. So, for example, an aggressive child may choose to watch violent films, engage in contact sports. So an example of nurture affecting nature we can see from a study by Maguire in 2000, in which she studied the brains of taxi drivers compared to controls or non-taxi drivers. And taxi drivers in London have to have a lot of real spatial knowledge. They have to have a memory of all the different roads and different areas in London that they might drive. And so the area of their brain associated with spatial memory, so the hippocampi, it was much larger in those who were taxi drivers than those who were not. And so we can see that the actual physical biology of the brain was affected by their nurture, so their experience. So nurture affecting nature there. And just a final thing to look at, and you might want to consider in AO3, is this idea of epigenetics. So what this is where a change in activity or a lifestyle event or choice that we make, it doesn't change the genetic code, but what it does is it leaves a mark on the genetic code, which tells our bodies which genes to switch on or off, if you like. And this mark can be left and passed on to future generations as well. So again, our life experience or the life experience of previous generations can cause an interaction, therefore, with nature and nurture. Now, just to say that there are some links to other debates, particularly determinism versus free will here. So if you're very strongly committed to either nature or nurture position, this corresponds to a belief in hard determinism. So nativism is biological determinism, empiricism is environmental determinism. So just to show that there are links there. Okay, so finally, just looking at a quick exam style question. So please pause the video and read through the scenario, and then I'll talk you through an example answer. So hopefully you would have read through the scenario about Farrell in his first year of his GCSEs. And the question asks, using your knowledge of the nature-nurture debate, outline possible explanations for Farrell's violent behaviour at school. So this is AO2 marks we're looking for here. We're looking for some application skills here for 6 marks. So I'll show you an example answer and then I'll talk you through how we might go about coming up with it. Okay. So again, pause the video, have a read through, and then I'll talk you through when you're ready. Okay, so hopefully you've had a quick read through of the answers, you've got a general idea. When we're answering a question like this, I kind of think of it in 2 steps at a time. So hopefully this highlighting will help show you what I mean. So the first thing I'm thinking is I need to select an appropriate bit of psychology, if you like, that is relevant to this STEM. So, first of all, I've thought, well, genetics here can explain, or maybe an explanation of Farrell's behaviour. So nature explanations refer to behaviour being caused by genes. So there's my bit of psychology, if you like, that I've put in yellow. And then I need to link it. I need to use this to explain the aspects of the scenario. So this is your second step. So in this case, 3 close male relatives suggests genetic factors may underlie Farrell's aggression. So I've thought that through. Now, because this is worth 6 marks, I'm thinking I'm going to do this 3 times, kind of like a mark for the psychology and a mark for the application there. So I repeat this twice more. So the psychology I pick out, nurture is the contribution of experience or interaction with the environment. Behaviourists would explain the aggression as learned or conditioned response. That's my bit of psychology. Then I apply it again. Farrell received attention for his behaviour from the head of year, which he may have found reinforcing. And then finally, I repeat it again for social learning theory. So that was the nature-nurture debate.